November 1st, 2025. 42 million Americans woke up to find their food assistance accounts at zero. No warning, no grace period, just gone. Teachers checking their balances before grocery shopping. Single mothers planning the week's meals. Seniors on fixed incomes rationing what little food they had left. In one morning, the nation's largest anti-hunger program, SNAP, simply stopped working. This wasn't a glitch. This was the first time in the program's 60-year history that the government completely froze funding. And what happened next revealed how close America's food system is to total collapse. Before we show you what happened when 42 million people lost access to food overnight, make sure you hit that subscribe button. This channel cuts through the noise to show you the economic realities most outlets won't touch. We're going deep on this crisis, and you need to see how it ends. Here's what most people don't understand. SNAP isn't just a welfare program. It's a $100 billion economic engine that keeps grocery stores open, farmers in business, and millions of families from starving. When it stopped, the entire system started breaking down within 48 hours. By sunrise on November 2nd, food bank lines wrapped around city blocks. By the weekend, emergency food supplies that normally lasted weeks were gone in days. And by the time courts ordered benefits restored 2 weeks later, the damage was already done. The question everyone's asking now, how did we get here? And the answer is going to shock you. The breakdown. When politics became starvation, the collapse didn't start on November 1st. It started months earlier, buried in budget negotiations that most Americans ignored. But stick with me, because what triggered this crisis is something that could happen again next month. SNAP depends on something called continuous appropriations. That's government speak for Congress must agree to fund this every single year or it stops. No exceptions, no emergency backup. The moment lawmakers can't agree, the USDA legally loses authority to send benefits. And in October 2025, they couldn't agree. The government shut down on October 1st, and it lasted 43 days, the longest in American history. During that time, SNAP survived on reserve funds. But those reserves were never designed to last more than a few weeks. On October 24th, the USDA sent an unprecedented notice to all 50 states. November benefits would not be funded. Here's where it gets critical, and this is something you need to understand for what's coming later in this video. The Anti-Deficiency Act, a law designed to prevent government overspending, became the weapon that starved millions. It prohibits federal agencies from obligating funds that Congress hasn't approved. Sounds reasonable, right? Except when it applies to food assistance during a shutdown, it means the government is legally required to let people go hungry rather than spend money Congress hasn't authorized. Think about that. The law says, we'd rather you starve than violate budget protocol. 42 million people, that's roughly 1 inch, 8 Americans rely on SNAP to eat. The average benefit is $187 per person per month. Not lavish, not excessive. Barely enough to cover basics. But for families already navigating record inflation, it's the difference between eating and not eating. And overnight, it vanished. The economic firestorm nobody saw coming. Now, here's what happened next. And this is where the story gets really dark. Stay with me. When SNAP stopped, 42 million people didn't just lose grocery money. They lost their ability to participate in the economy. Because SNAP isn't charity, it's economic stimulus that keeps entire communities afloat. Every dollar of SNAP spending generates $1.54 in economic activity. Do the math. $100 billion in annual benefits creates approximately $154 billion in local economic impact. When you remove that much purchasing power from the economy instantly, businesses collapse, supply chains freeze, and communities spiral into crisis. Within 72 hours, small grocery stores in low-income areas saw revenue drop 20–30%. These aren't Walmart or Kroger. These are neighborhood markets where SNAP transactions make up the majority of their sales. Some cut hours, some laid off workers. A few closed permanently. Farmers markets that depend on SNAP redemptions watch sales crater. In rural America, where agricultural income is already razor thin, losing 10–15% of demand can destroy family farms that have operated for generations. And this is just the beginning. Wait until you see what happened to food banks. It's something most people still don't fully understand. When charity became crisis, the food bank collapsed. Food banks were never designed to replace SNAP. Let me say that again. Food banks were never designed to replace SNAP. SNAP distributes the equivalent of over 1 billion pounds of purchasing power into the food economy every week. Food banks, by comparison, typically distribute 50,000 to 150,000 pounds per week at individual locations. The scale was impossible from day one. Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization, reported demand surges of 45% within 48 hours of the benefit freeze. Some locations saw traffic triple in a single weekend. Lines formed before sunrise, cars wrapped around stadiums, schools, and church parking lots for hours. Volunteers faced impossible choices. Who gets food? Who gets turned away? How do you tell a mother with 3 kids that there's nothing left? The supply side made everything worse. Food banks depend on 3 main sources: grocery chain donations, farmer surplus, and government commodity programs. During the shutdown, all 3 dried up simultaneously. Retailers donated less because their own profit margins were crushed by inflation. Farmers had fewer surplus crops due to rising fertilizer and fuel costs. And the government, frozen by the shutdown, couldn't release emergency food reserves even though warehouses were full. Warehouses that normally held weeks of inventory were reduced to days. In some regions, hours. This created a nightmare scenario that's about to get even worse. Because the people showing up at food banks weren't who you think. The invisible crisis, when working families couldn't eat. Here's what shocked food bank volunteers across the country. The people in line weren't unemployed. They had jobs, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs. Teachers making $45,000 a year. Warehouse workers, delivery drivers, home health aides, retail employees. People earning $28,000 to $50,000 annually, incomes that look stable on paper but collapse under real-world costs. After rent, $1,600 for a modest apartment, utilities, $400, transportation, $300, and basic childcare, $800, there's almost nothing left. When grocery prices jumped 21% in 3 years, these families were already cutting back. SNAP wasn't a luxury, it was the only thing preventing full-blown hunger. Federal data shows nearly 60% of SNAP recipients work. They're not avoiding employment. They're employed and still can't afford food. When benefits froze, they had no safety net. Surveys show 60% of low-income households have less than $500 in emergency savings. One unexpected bill, a car repair, a medical copay, an overdue utility, and they're in crisis mode. Food insecurity among working families increased 30% between 2021 and 2025. These aren't statistics. These are your coworkers, your neighbors, the person checking you out at the grocery store. And the people hit hardest? That's coming up, and it's going to break your heart. The children who went hungry. More than 16 million children depend on SNAP. That's 39% of all recipients, kids under 18, whose bodies are still developing, whose brains are still forming, whose futures depend on consistent nutrition. When benefits stopped, the burden shifted to schools. And schools were not prepared. Districts across the country reported sudden surges in free meal participation, increases of 12-20% in some areas within weeks. Children showing up earlier, asking for seconds, visibly hungrier than before. Teachers noticed students complaining of headaches, struggling to concentrate, showing signs of malnutrition that hadn't been there before. School nurses saw increases in fainting incidents and dehydration cases. The timing made it catastrophic. November includes Thanksgiving break, teacher workdays, and scattered holidays, days without school-provided meals. For thousands of children, those days meant no food at all. Chronic childhood hunger doesn't just affect the present, it shapes lifelong outcomes. Studies show malnutrition in childhood reduces cognitive performance, weakens immune systems, slows physical development, and increases risk of chronic health problems later in life. Effects that influence high school graduation rates, college attendance, earning potential, and even life expectancy. The government shutdown didn't just create a temporary food crisis, it damaged an entire generation's future. And we won't know the full cost for decades. But here's where the political battle gets truly ugly. What you're about to hear will make you furious. The politics of starvation, how hunger became a weapon. While 42 million Americans went hungry, Congress fought over everything except food. SNAP funding requires a simple appropriations bill. A few pages, a few votes, pass it, and people eat. Fail, and they starve. It should have been the easiest thing Congress did all year. Instead, lawmakers attached SNAP funding to massive budget negotiations involving immigration, defense spending, and $1.6 trillion in federal appropriations. They turned feeding hungry children into a bargaining chip for political leverage. One side demanded stricter work requirements, arguing able-bodied adults should meet employment mandates to receive benefits. The other side resisted changes, warning millions could lose access and that verification systems were already overwhelmed. Meanwhile, millions of families watched their EBT balances hit zero, while politicians debated policy changes that had nothing to do with the immediate emergency. Bills were introduced more than a dozen times. Each one failed. Each failed vote pushed more people into hunger. And here's the part that should infuse you. The government had the money. Emergency SNAP reserves held over $5 billion, more than enough to cover November and December benefits in full. But the Anti-Deficiency Act prevented the USDA from accessing those funds without explicit congressional authorization. 2 federal judges ruled the freeze was likely unlawful and ordered benefits restored. The Trump administration initially said it would only fund 50% of benefits, then 65%. States scrambled to figure out how to distribute partial payments while court battles continued. On November 12th, 43 days into the shutdown, Congress finally passed a funding bill. The shutdown ended. Benefits were ordered restored, but the damage was already done. And the economic aftermath? It's still unfolding. Here's what most people don't realize: the economic chain reaction that's still spreading. When SNAP disappeared, the economic damage spread like a virus through communities. Small grocery stores in low-income areas saw 20-30% revenue drops overnight. Some laid off workers. Others cut hours. A few closed permanently, creating food deserts that will take years to recover. Local farmers who depend on farmers market SNAP redemptions lost 10-15% of seasonal income, enough to destroy farms operating on thin margins. Hospitals reported spikes in malnutrition-related emergency room visits, dehydration, fainting, chronic conditions worsening from lack of proper nutrition. Each ER visit costs $1,200, $3,000, and many uninsured patients can't pay. The cost shifts to taxpayers, adding pressure to a healthcare system already strained by inflation. The shutdown cost the economy billions, not in direct spending, but in lost productivity, emergency healthcare costs, closed businesses, and long-term damage to communities that will take years to repair. But here's what really matters going forward. And this is why you need to pay attention to what I'm about to say. Why this will happen again and soon. The November 2025 SNAP crisis wasn't a one-time failure. It was a stress test that revealed how fragile America's food system has become. SNAP depends on annual appropriations. Every single year, Congress must agree to fund it. And every single year, the threat of shutdown looms. The program was designed in the 1,960 seconds for an economy with stable jobs, predictable incomes, and accessible grocery stores. None of that describes modern America. Today's workforce is dominated by gig jobs, irregular schedules, and unpredictable earnings. Communities face food deserts where full-service stores have vanished. Yet SNAP still operates on rigid rules and monthly benefit cycles that assume life follows a consistent pattern. Income verification systems can't handle variable paychecks. A single fluctuating paycheck can temporarily push people over income limits, cutting off benefits they still desperately need. Geographic barriers trap families in areas with no nearby grocery stores. SNAP provides money, but if the nearest store is 15 miles away and you don't have reliable transportation, that money becomes useless. Digital dependency shuts out people with older phones, limited internet, or unstable data plans. Miss one online notification, and benefits stop. No warning, no grace period. The system is vulnerable by design, and until these structural problems are fixed, every government shutdown, every budget battle, every political standoff puts 42 million people at risk of starvation. The choice America faces now. The November 2025 crisis is over. Benefits have been restored. Food banks are restocking. Lines are shortening. But the vulnerability remains. 42 million Americans are one political disagreement away from hunger, one shutdown away from empty shelves, one failed vote away from watching their children go to bed without food. This isn't a temporary problem. It's a structural crisis that will repeat until the system itself changes. The next shutdown is already being threatened for early 2026. Budget negotiations are stalling again. The same political dynamics that created this crisis are still in place. So here's the question. Will America fix the broken system that let this happen? Or will we wait for the next crisis, the next shutdown, the next time 42 million people wake up to find their food assistance gone? The answer to that question will determine whether this was a warning we heeded or a preview of something much worse to come. If this video opened your eyes to how vulnerable our food system really is, subscribe right now. We're covering the economic crises most channels ignore, the ones that actually affect your life. Hit that notification bell because this story isn't over. And next time, it could be even worse. The choice is ours. The clock is ticking, and millions of Americans are still one vote away from going hungry.